The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 5. How quietly, how uneventfully, how pleasantly sped the next few days. Already life was settling down into a groove. Waiting on Mr. Sleuth was just what Mrs. Bunting could manage to do easily and without tiring herself. It had at once become clear that the lodger preferred to be waited on only by one person, and that person his landlady. He gave her very little trouble. Indeed, it did her good having to wait on the lodger. It even did her good that he was not like other gentlemen, for the fact occupied her mind, and in a way it amused her. The more so that whatever his oddities, Mr. Sleuth had none of those tiresome, disagreeable ways with which landladies are only too familiar, and which seem peculiar only to those human beings who also happen to be lodgers. To take but one point, Mr. Sleuth did not ask to be called unduly early. Bunting and his Ellen had fallen into the way of lying rather late in the morning, and it was a great comfort not to have to turn out to make the lodger a cup of tea at 7 or even half-past 7. Mr. Sleuth seldom required anything before 11. But odd he certainly was. The second evening he had been with them, Mr. Sleuth had brought in a book of which the queer name was Cruden's Concordance. That and the Bible, Mrs. Bunting had soon discovered that there was a relation between the two books, seemed to be the lodger's only reading. He spent hours each day, generally after he had eaten the breakfast which also served for luncheon, poring over the Old Testament and over that strange kind of index to the book. As for the delicate and yet the all-important question of money, Mr. Sleuth was everything that the most exacting landlady could have wished. Never had there been a more confiding or trusting gentleman. On the very first day he had been with them he had allowed his money, the considerable sum of 184 sovereigns, to lie about wrapped up in little pieces of rather dirty newspaper on his dressing-table. That had quite upset Mrs. Bunting. She had allowed herself respectfully to point out to him that what he was doing was foolish, indeed wrong. But as only answer he had laughed, and she had been startled when the loud, unusual, and discordant sound had issued from his thin lips. "I know those I can trust," he had answered, stuttering, rather as was his way when moved. And I assure you, Mrs. Bunting, that I hardly have to speak to a human being, especially to a woman," and he had drawn in his breath with a hissing sound, "before I know exactly what manner of person is before me." It hadn't taken the landlady very long to find out that her lodger had a queer kind of fear and dislike of women. When she was doing the staircase and landings, she would often hear Mr. Sleuth reading aloud to himself passages in the Bible that were very uncomplimentary to her sex. But Mrs. Bunting had no very great opinion of her sister woman, so that didn't put her out. Besides, where one's lodger is concerned, a dislike of women is better than the other thing. In any case, where would have been the good of worrying about the lodger's funny ways? Of course, Mr. Sleuth was eccentric. If he hadn't been, as Bunting funnily styled it, just a leetle touched upstairs, he wouldn't be here, living this strange, solitary life in lodgings. He would be living in quite a different sort of way with some of his relatives, or with a friend of his own class. There came a time when Mrs. Bunting, looking back, as even the least imaginative of us are apt to look back to any part of our own past lives, which becomes for any reason poignantly memorable, wondered how soon it was that she had discovered that her lodger was given to creeping out of the house at a time when almost all living things prefer to sleep. She brought herself to believe, but I am inclined to doubt whether she was right in so believing, that the first time she became aware of this strange nocturnal habit of Mr. Sleuth happened to be during the night which preceded the day on which she had observed a very curious circumstance. This very curious circumstance was the complete disappearance of one of Mr. Sleuth's 3 suits of clothes. It always passes my comprehension how people can remember, over any length of time, not every moment of certain happenings, for that is natural enough, but the day, the hour, the minute when these happenings took place. Much as she thought about it afterwards, even Mrs. Bunting never quite made up her mind whether it was during the 5th or the 6th night of Mr. Sleuth's stay under her roof that she became aware that he had gone out at 2 in the morning and had only come in at 5. But that there did come such a night is certain as is the fact that her discovery coincided with various occurrences which were destined to remain retrospectively memorable. It was intensely dark, intensely quiet, the darkest, quietest hour of the night, when suddenly Mrs. Bunting was awakened from a deep, dreamless sleep by sounds at once unexpected and familiar. She knew at once what those sounds were. They were those made by Mr. Sleuth, first coming down the stairs and walking on tiptoe. She was sure it was on tiptoe, past her door, and finally softly shutting the front door behind him. Try as she would, Mrs. Bunting found it quite impossible to go to sleep again. There she lay, wide awake, afraid to move lest Bunting should waken up too, till she heard Mr. Sleuth, 3 hours later, creep back into the house and so up to bed. Then, and not till then, she slept again. But in the morning she felt very tired, so tired indeed that she had been very glad when Bunting good-naturedly suggested that he should go out and do their little bit of marketing. The worthy couple had very soon discovered that in the matter of catering it was not altogether an easy matter to satisfy Mr. Sleuth, and that though he always tried to appear pleased, this perfect lodger had one serious fault from the point of view of those who keep lodgings. Strange to say, he was a vegetarian. He would not eat meat in any form. He sometimes, however, condescended to a chicken, and when he did so condescend, he generously intimated that Mr. and Mrs. Bunting were welcome to a share in it. Now today, this day of which the happenings were to linger in Mrs. Bunting's mind so very long, and to remain so very vivid, it had been arranged that Mr. Sleuth was to have some fish for his lunch, while what he left was to be done up to serve for his simple supper. Knowing that Bunting would be out for at least an hour, for he was a gregarious soul, and liked to have a gossip in the shops he frequented, Mrs. Bunting rose and dressed in a leisurely manner. Then she went and did her front sitting-room. She felt languid and dull, as one is apt to feel after a broken night, and it was a comfort to her to know that Mr. Sleuth was not likely to ring before 12. But long before 12 a loud ring suddenly clanged through the quiet house. She knew it for the front door-bell. Mrs. Bunting frowned. No doubt the ring betokened one of those tiresome people who come round for old bottles and such-like fal-lals. She went slowly, reluctantly to the door, and then her face cleared, for it was that good young chap Joe Chandler who stood waiting outside. He was breathing a little hard, as if he had walked over quickly through the moist foggy air. "Why, Joe," said Mrs. Bunting wonderingly. "Come in, do. Bunting's out, but he won't be very long now. You've been quite a stranger these last few days." "Well, you know why, Mrs. Bunting." She stared at him for a moment, wondering what he could mean. Then suddenly she remembered. Why, of course, Joe was on a big job just now, the job of trying to catch the Avenger. Her husband had alluded to the fact again and again when reading out to her little bits from the halfpenny evening paper he was taking again. She led the way to the sitting-room. It was a good thing Bunting had insisted on lighting the fire before he went out, for now the room was nice and warm, and it was just horrible outside. She had felt a chill go right through her as she had stood, even for that second at the front door. And she hadn't been alone to feel it, for, "I say, it is jolly to be in here out of that awful cold," exclaimed Chandler, sitting down heavily in Bunting's easy-chair. And then Mrs. Bunting bethought herself that the young man was tired as well as cold. He was pale, almost pallid under his usual healthy tanned complexion, the complexion of the man who lives much out of doors. "Wouldn't you like me just to make you a cup of tea?" she said solicitously. "Well, to tell truth, I should be right down thankful for one, Mrs. Bunting." Then he looked round, and again he said her name, "Mrs. Bunting." He spoke in so odd, so thick a tone that she turned quickly. "Yes, what is it, Joe?" she asked, and then in sudden terror, "You've never come to tell me that anything's happened to Bunting. He's not had an accident?" "Goodness, no. Whatever made you think that?" But Mrs. Bunting, there's been another of them." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. He was staring at her with unhappy, it seemed to her, terror-filled eyes. "Another of them?" She looked at him, bewildered, at a loss, and then what he meant flashed across her. Another of them meant another of these strange, mysterious, awful murders. But her relief for the moment was so great, for she really had thought for a second that he had come to give her ill news of Bunting, that the feeling that she did experience on hearing this piece of news was actually pleasurable, though she would have been much shocked had that fact been brought to her notice. Almost in spite of herself, Mrs. Bunting had become keenly interested in the amazing series of crimes which was occupying the imagination of the whole of London's netherworld. Even her refined mind had busied itself for the last 2 or 3 days with the strange problem so frequently presented to it by Bunting. For Bunting, now that they were no longer worried, took an open, unashamed, intense interest in the Avenger and his doings. She took the kettle off the gas ring. "It's a pity Bunting isn't here," she said, drawing in her breath. "He'd have liked so much to hear you tell all about it, Joe." As she spoke, she was pouring boiling water into a little teapot. But Chandler said nothing, and she turned and glanced at him. "Why, you do look bad," she exclaimed. And indeed the young fellow did look bad, very bad indeed. "I can't help it," he said with a kind of gasp. "It was your saying that about my telling you all about it that made me turn queer. You see, this time I was one of the first there, and it fairly turned me sick, that it did. Well, it was too awful, Mrs. Bunting. Don't talk of it." He began gulping down the hot tea before it was well made. She looked at him with sympathetic interest. "Why, Joe," she said, "I never would have thought, with all the horrible sights you see, that anything could upset you like that." "This isn't like anything there's ever been before," he said. And then, "Oh, Mrs. Bunting, 'twas I that discovered the piece of paper this time." "Then it is true," she cried eagerly. "It is the Avenger's bit of paper. Bunting always said it was. He never believed in that practical joker." "I did," said Chandler reluctantly. "You see, there are some queer fellows, even, he lowered his voice and looked round him as if the walls had ears, "even in the force, Mrs. Bunting, and these murders have fair got on our nerves." "No, never," she said. "Do you think that a bobby might do a thing like that?" He nodded impatiently, as if the question wasn't worth answering. Then, "It was all along of that bit of paper and my finding it while the poor soul was still warm," he shuddered, "that brought me out west this morning. One of our bosses lives close by in Prince Albert Terrace, and I had to go and tell him all about it. They never offered me a bit or a sup. I think they might have done that, don't you, Mrs. Bunting?" "Yes," she said absently. "Yes, I do think so. But there, I don't know that I ought to say that," went on Chandler. "He had me up in his dressing room and was very considerate like to me while I was telling him." "Have a bit of something now?" she said suddenly. "Oh, no, I couldn't eat anything," he said hastily. "I don't feel as if I could ever eat anything any more." "That'll only make you ill." Mrs. Bunting spoke rather crossly, for she was a sensible woman, and to please her he took a bite out of the slice of bread and butter she had cut for him. "I expect you're right," he said, "and I've a goodish heavy day in front of me. Been up since 4, too." "4?" she said. "Was it then they found—" She hesitated a moment and then said, "It?" He nodded. "It was just a chance I was nearby. If I'd been half a minute sooner, either I or the officer who found her must have knocked up against that monster. But 2 or 3 people do think they saw him slinking away." "What was he like?" she asked curiously. "Well, that's hard to answer. You see, there was such an awful fog. But there's one thing they all agree about. He was carrying a bag." "A bag?" repeated Mrs. Bunting in a low voice. "Whatever sort of bag might it have been, Joe?" There had come across her, just right in her middle like, such a strange sensation, a curious kind of tremor or fluttering. She was at a loss to account for it. "Just a handbag," said Joe Chandler vaguely. "A woman I spoke to, cross-examining her like, who was positive she had seen him, said, just a tall, thin shadow, that's what he was, a tall, thin shadow of a man, with a bag." "With a bag," repeated Mrs. Bunting absently. "How very strange and peculiar." "Why, no, not strange at all. He has to carry the thing he does the deed with in something, Mrs. Bunting. We've always wondered how he hid it. They generally throws the knife or firearms away, you know." "Do they indeed?" Mrs. Bunting still spoke in that absent, wondering way. She was thinking that she really must try and see what the lodger had done with his bag. It was possible, in fact, when one came to think of it, it was very probable, that he had just lost it, being so forgetful a gentleman, on one of the days he had gone out, as she knew he was fond of doing, into the Regent's Park. "There'll be a description circulated in an hour or 2, went on Chandler. "Perhaps that'll help catch him. There isn't a London man or woman, I don't suppose, who wouldn't give a good bit to lay that chap by the heels. Well, I suppose I must be going now." "Won't you wait a bit longer for Bunting?" she said hesitatingly. "No, I can't do that, but I'll come in maybe either this evening or tomorrow and tell you any more that's happened. Thanks kindly for the tea. It's main a man of me, Mrs. Bunting." "Well, you've had enough to unman you, Joe." "Aye, that I have," he said heavily. A few minutes later Bunting did come in, and he and his wife had quite a little tiff, the first tiff they had had since Mr. Sleuth became their lodger. It fell out this way. When he heard who had been there, Bunting was angry that Mrs. Bunting hadn't got more details of the horrible occurrence which had taken place that morning out of Chandler. "You don't mean to say, Ellen, that you can't even tell me where it happened?" he said indignantly. "I suppose you put Chandler off. That's what you did. Why, whatever did he come here for, excepting to tell us all about it?" "He came to have something to eat and drink," snapped out Mrs. Bunting. "That's what the poor lad came for, if you want to know. He could hardly speak of it at all, he felt so bad. In fact, he didn't say a word about it until he'd come right into the room and sat down. He told me quite enough." "Didn't he tell you if the piece of paper on which the murderer had written his name was square or three-cornered?" demanded Bunting. "No, he did not, and that isn't the sort of thing I should have cared to ask him." "The more fool you—" and then he stopped abruptly. The newsboys were coming down the Marylebone Road, shouting out the awful discovery which had been made that morning, that of the Avenger's 5th murder. Bunting went out to buy a paper, and his wife took the things he had brought in down to the kitchen. The noise the newspaper sellers made outside had evidently wakened Mr. Sleuth, for his landlady hadn't been in the kitchen 10 minutes before his bell rang. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 6. Mr. Sleuth's bell rang again. Mr. Sleuth's breakfast was quite ready, but for the first time since he had been her lodger, Mrs. Bunting did not answer the summons at once. But when there came the second imperative tinkle, for electric bells had not been fitted into that old-fashioned house, she made up her mind to go upstairs. As she emerged into the hall from the kitchen stairway, Bunting, sitting comfortably in their parlor, heard his wife stepping heavily under the load of the well-laden tray. "Wait a minute," he called out. "I'll help you, Ellen," and he came out and took the tray from her. She said nothing, and together they proceeded up to the drawing-room floor landing. There she stopped him. "Here," she whispered quickly. "You give me that, Bunting. The lodger won't like your going in to him." And then, as he obeyed her and was about to turn downstairs again, she added in a rather acid tone, "You might open the door for me at any rate. How can I manage to do it with this here heavy tray on my hands?" She spoke in a queer, jerky way, and Bunting felt surprised, rather put out. Ellen wasn't exactly what you'd call a lively, jolly woman, but when things were going well, as now, she was generally equable enough. He supposed she was still resentful of the way he had spoken to her about young Chandler and the new Avenger murder. However, he was always for peace, so he opened the drawing-room door, and as soon as he had started going downstairs, Mrs. Bunting walked into the room. And then at once there came over her the queerest feeling of relief, of lightness of heart. As usual, the lodger was sitting at his old place reading the Bible. Somehow, she could not have told you why, she would not willingly have told herself, she had expected to see Mr. Sleuth looking different. But no, he appeared to be exactly the same. In fact, as he glanced up at her, a pleasanter smile than usual lighted up his thin, pallid face. "Well, Mrs. Bunting," he said genially, "I overslept myself this morning, but I feel all the better for the rest." "I'm glad of that, sir," she answered in a low voice. "One of the ladies I once lived with used to say, 'Rest is an old-fashioned remedy, but it's the best remedy of all.'" Mr. Sleuth himself removed the Bible and Prudence Concordance off the table out of her way, and then he stood watching his landlady laying the cloth. Suddenly he spoke again. He was not often so talkative in the morning. "I think, Mrs. Bunting, that there was someone with you outside the door just now?" "Yes, sir. Bunting helped me up with the tray." "I'm afraid I give you a good deal of trouble," he said hesitatingly. but she answered quickly, "Oh, no, sir, not at all, sir. I was only saying yesterday that we've never had a lodger that gave us as little trouble as you do, sir." "I'm glad of that. I am aware that my habits are somewhat peculiar." He looked at her fixedly, as if expecting her to give some sort of denial to this observation, but Mrs. Bunting was an honest and truthful woman. It never occurred to her to question his statement. Mr. Sleuth's habits were somewhat peculiar. Take that going out at night, or rather in the early morning, for instance. So she remained silent. After she had laid the lodger's breakfast on the table, she prepared to leave the room. "I suppose I'm not to do your room till you goes out, sir?" And Mr. Sleuth looked up sharply. "No, no," he said. "I never want my room done when I am engaged in studying the Scriptures, Mrs. Bunting. But I am not going out today. I shall be carrying out a somewhat elaborate experiment upstairs. If I go out at all—" He waited a moment, and again he looked at her fixedly. "I shall wait till night time to do so." And then, coming back to the matter in hand, he added hastily, "Perhaps you could do my room when I go upstairs, about 5 o'clock, if that time is convenient to you, that is." "Oh, yes, sir, that'll do nicely." Mrs. Bunting went downstairs, and as she did so she took herself wordlessly, ruthlessly to task, but she did not face, even in her inmost heart, the strange tenors and tremors which had so shaken her. She only repeated to herself again and again, "I've got upset, that's what I've done." And then she spoke aloud, "I must get myself a dose at the chemist's next time I'm out. That's what I must do." And just as she murmured the word "do," there came a loud double knock on the front door. It was only the postman's knock, but the postman was an unfamiliar visitor in that house, and Mrs. Bunting started violently. She was nervous. That's what was the matter with her, so she told herself angrily. No doubt this was a letter for Mr. Sleuth. The lodger must have relations and acquaintances somewhere in the world. All gentlefolk have. But when she picked the small envelope off the hall floor, she saw it was a letter from Daisy, her husband's daughter. "Bunting," she called out sharply, "here's a letter for you." She opened the door of their sitting room and looked in. Yes, there was her husband, sitting back comfortably in his easy-chair, reading a paper, and as she saw his broad, rather rounded back, Mrs. Bunting felt a sudden thrill of sharp irritation. There he was, doing nothing, in fact doing worse than nothing, wasting his time reading all about those horrid crimes. She sighed, a long, unconscious sigh. Bunting was getting into idle ways, bad ways for a man of his years, but how could she prevent it? He had been such an active, conscientious sort of man when they had first made acquaintance. She also could remember, even more clearly than Bunting did himself, that first meeting of theirs in the dining room of number 90 Cumberland Terrace. As she had stood there, pouring out her mistress's glass of port wine, she had not been too much absorbed in her task to have a good out-of-her-eye look at the spruce, nice, respectable-looking fellow who was standing over by the window. How superior he had appeared even then to the man she already hoped he would succeed as butler. Today, perhaps because she was not feeling quite herself, the past rose before her very vividly, and a lump came into her throat. Putting the letter addressed to her husband on the table, she closed the door softly and went down into the kitchen. There were various little things to put away and clean up, as well as their dinner to cook. And all the time she was down there, she fixed her mind obstinately, determinedly on Bunting and on the problem of Bunting. She wondered what she'd better do to get him into good ways again. Thanks to Mr. Sleuth, their outlook was now moderately bright. A week ago everything had seemed utterly hopeless. It seemed as if nothing could save them from disaster. But everything was now changed. Perhaps it would be well for her to go and see the new proprietor of that registry office in Baker Street, which had lately changed hands. It would be a good thing for Bunting to get even an occasional job. For the matter of that, he could now take up a fairly regular thing in the way of waiting. Mrs. Bunting knew that it isn't easy to get a man out of idle ways once he has acquired those ways. When at last she went upstairs again, she felt a little ashamed of what she had been thinking, for Bunting had laid the cloth, and laid it very nicely, too, and brought up the 2 chairs to the table. "Ellen," he cried eagerly, "here's news. Daisy's coming tomorrow. There's scarlet fever in their house. Old Aunt thinks she'd better come away for a few days. So you see she'll be here for her birthday. 18, that's what she'll be on the 19th. It do make me feel old, that it do." Mrs. Bunting put down the tray. "I can't have the girl here just now," she said shortly. "I've just as much to do as I can manage. The lodger gives me more trouble than you seem to think for." "Rubbish," he said sharply. "I'll help you with the lodger. It's your own fault you haven't had help with him before. Of course Daisy must come here. Whatever other place could the girl go to?" Bunting felt pugnacious, so cheerful as to be almost light-hearted. But as he looked across at his wife, his feeling of satisfaction vanished. Ellen's face was pinched and drawn today. She looked ill and horribly tired. It was very aggravating of her to go and behave like this, just when they were beginning to get on nicely again. "For the matter of that," he said suddenly, "Daisy'll be able to help you with the work, Ellen, and she'll brisk us both up a bit." Mrs. Bunting made no answer. She sat down heavily at the table, and then she said languidly, "You might as well show me the girl's letter." He handed it across to her, and she read it slowly to herself. "Dear Father," it ran, "I hope this finds you as well as it leaves me. Mrs. Puddle's youngest has got scarlet fever, and Aunt thinks I'd better come away at once, just to stay with you for a few days. Please tell Ellen I won't give her no trouble. I'll start at 10 if I don't hear nothing. Your loving daughter." "Yes, I suppose Daisy will have to come here," Mrs. Bunting said slowly. "It'll do her good to have a bit of work to do for once in her life." And with that ungraciously worded permission, Bunting had to content himself. Quietly the rest of that eventful day sped by. When dusk fell, Mr. Sleuth's landlady heard him go upstairs to the top floor. She remembered that this was a signal for her to go and do his room. He was a tidy man, was the lodger. He did not throw his things about as so many gentlemen do, leaving them all over the place. No, he kept everything scrupulously tidy. His clothes and the various articles Mrs. Bunting had bought for him during the first 2 days he had been there were carefully arranged in the chest of drawers. He had lately purchased a pair of boots. Those he had arrived in were peculiar-looking footgear, buff leather shoes with rubber soles, and he had told his landlady on that very first day that he never wished them to go down to be cleaned. A funny idea, a funny habit that, of going out for a walk after midnight in weather so cold and foggy that all other folk were glad to be at home snug in bed. But then Mr. Sleuth himself admitted that he was a funny sort of gentleman. After she had done his bedroom, the landlady went into the sitting room and gave it a good dusting. This room was not kept quite as nice as she would have liked it to be. Mrs. Bunting longed to give the drawing-room something of a good turnout, but Mr. Sleuth disliked her to be moving about in it when he himself was in his bedroom, and when up he sat there almost all the time. Delighted as he had seemed to be with the top room, he only used it when making his mysterious experiments, and never during the daytime. And now, this afternoon, she looked at the rosewood chiffonier with longing eyes. She even gave that pretty little piece of furniture a slight shake. If only the doors would fly open, as the locked doors of old cupboards sometimes do, even after they have been securely fastened, how pleased she would be, how much more comfortable somehow she would feel. But the chiffonier refused to give up its secret. About 8 o'clock on that same evening, Joe Chandler came in, just for a few minutes' chat. He had recovered from his agitation of the morning, but he was full of eager excitement, and Mrs. Bunting listened in silence, intensely interested in spite of herself, while he and Bunting talked. "Yes," he said, "I'm as right as a trivet now. I've had a good rest, laid down all this afternoon. You see, the yard thinks there's going to be something on tonight. He's always done them in pairs." "So he has," exclaimed Bunting wonderingly. "So he has. Now I never thought of that. Then you think, Joe, that the monster will be on the job again tonight?" Chandler nodded. "Yes, and I think there's a very good chance of his being caught, too." "I suppose there will be a lot on the watch tonight, eh?" "I should think there will be. How many of our men do you think there will be on night duty tonight, Mr. Bunting?" Bunting shook his head. "I don't know," he said helplessly. "I mean extra," suggested Chandler in an encouraging voice. 1,000, ventured Bunting. 5,000, Mr. Bunting. "Never!" exclaimed Bunting, amazed. And even Mrs. Bunting echoed, "Never," incredulously. "Yes, that there will. You see, the boss has got his monkey up." Chandler drew a folded-up newspaper out of his coat pocket. "Just listen to this." The police have reluctantly to admit that they have no clue to the perpetrators of these horrible crimes, and we cannot feel any surprise at the information that a popular attack has been organized on the Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. There is even talk of an indignation mass meeting. What do you think of that? That's not a pleasant thing for a gentleman as is doing his best to read, eh? Well, it does seem queer that the police can't catch him now, doesn't it? Said Bunting argumentatively. I don't think it's queer at all, said young Chandler crossly. Now you just listen again. Here's a bit of the truth for once, in a newspaper. And slowly he read out. The detection of crime in London now resembles a game of blind man's buff, in which the detective has his hands tied and his eyes bandaged, thus as he turned loose to hunt the murderer through the slums of a great city. Whatever does that mean? Said Bunting. Your hands aren't tied and your eyes aren't bandaged, Joe. It's metaphorical like that it's intended, Mr. Bunting. We haven't got the same facilities. No, not a quarter of them, that the French techs have. And then for the first time Mrs. Bunting spoke. What was that word, Joe? Perpetrators. I mean that first bit you read out. Yes, he said, turning to her eagerly. Then do they think there's more than one of them? She said, and a look of relief came over her thin face. There's some of our chaps thinks it's a gang, said Chandler. They say it can't be the work of one man. What do you think, Joe? Well, Mrs. Bunting, I don't know what to think. I'm fair puzzled. He got up. Don't you come to the door. I'll shut it all right. So long. See you tomorrow, perhaps. As he had done the other evening, Mr. and Mrs. Bunting's visitor stopped at the door. Any news of Miss Daisy? He asked casually. Yes, she's coming tomorrow, said her father. They've got scarlet fever at her place, so old Aunt thinks she's better clear out. The husband and wife went to bed early that night, but Mrs. Bunting found she could not sleep. She lay wide awake, hearing the hours, the half-hours, the quarters chime out from the belfry of the old church close by. And then, just as she was dozing off, it must have been about 1 o'clock, she heard the sound she had half unconsciously been expecting to hear, that of the lodger's stealthy footsteps coming down the stairs just outside her room. He crept along the passage and let himself out very, very quietly. But though she tried to keep awake, Mrs. Bunting did not hear him come in again, for she soon fell into a heavy sleep. Oddly enough, she was the first to wake the next morning. Odder still, it was she, not Bunting, who jumped out of bed and, going out into the passage, picked up the newspaper which had just been pushed to the letter-box. But having picked it up, Mrs. Bunting did not go back at once into her bedroom. Instead, she lit the gas in the passage, and leaning up against the wall to steady herself, for she was trembling with cold and fatigue, she opened the paper. Yes, there was the heading she sought, The Avenger Murders. But oh, how glad she was to see the words that followed. Up to the time of going to press, there is little new to report concerning the extraordinary series of crimes which are amazing and indeed staggering not only London, but the whole civilized world, and which would seem to be the work of some woman-hating teetotal fanatic. Since yesterday morning, when the last of these dastardly murders was committed, no reliable clue to the perpetrator or perpetrators has been obtained, though several arrests were made in the course of the day. In every case, however, those arrested were able to prove a satisfactory alibi. And then, a little lower down, the excitement grows and grows. It is not too much to say that even a stranger to London would know that something very unusual was in the air. As for the place where the murder was committed last night. Last night, thought Mrs. Bunting, startled, and then she realized that last night in this connection meant the night before last. She began the sentence again. As for the place where the murder was committed last night, all approaches to it were still blocked up to a late hour by hundreds of onlookers, though of course nothing now remains in the way of traces of the tragedy. Slowly and carefully Mrs. Bunting folded the paper up again in its original creases, and then she stooped and put it back down on the mat where she had found it. She then turned out the gas, and going back into bed, she lay down by her still sleeping husband. "Anything the matter?" Bunting murmured, and stirred uneasily. "Anything the matter, Ellen?" She answered in a whisper thrilling with a strange gladness. "No, nothing, Bunting, nothing the matter. Go to sleep again, my dear." They got up an hour later, both in a happy, cheerful mood. Bunting rejoiced at the thought of his daughter's coming, and even Daisy's stepmother told herself that it would be pleasant having the girl about the house to help her a bit. About 10 o'clock, Bunting went out to do some shopping. He brought back with him a nice little bit of pork for Daisy's dinner and 3 mince pies. He even remembered to get some apples for the sauce. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 7. Just as 12 was striking, a four-wheeler drew up to the gate. It brought Daisy, pink-cheeked, excited, laughing-eyed Daisy, a sight to gladden any father's heart. "Old Aunt said I was to have a cab if the weather was bad," she cried out joyously. There was a bit of a wrangle over the fare. King's Cross, as all the world knows, is nothing like 2 miles from the Marylebone Road, but the man clamored for 1 and 6 pence, and hinted darkly that he had done the young lady a favor in bringing her at all. While he and Bunting were having words, Daisy, leaving them to it, walked up the flagged path to the door where her stepmother was awaiting her. As they were exchanging a rather frigid kiss—indeed, 'twas a mere peck on Mrs. Bunting's part—there fell, with startling suddenness, loud cries on the still, cold air. Long drawn and wailing, they sounded strangely sad as they rose and fell across the distant roar of traffic in the Edgware Road. "What's that?" exclaimed Bunting wonderingly. "Why, whatever's that?" The cabman lowered his voice. "Them's a-crying out that 'orrible affair at King's Cross. He's done for 2 of 'em this time. That's what I meant when I said I might 'a' got a better fare. I wouldn't say nothink before little Missy there, but folk have been coming from all over London the last 5 or 6 hours, plenty of toffs, too. But there's nothing to see now." "What, another woman murdered last night?" Bunting felt tremendously thrilled. What had the 5,000 constables been about, to let such a dreadful thing happen? The cabman stared at him surprised. "2 of 'em, I tell yer, within a few yards of one another. He have got a nerve, but of course they was drunk. He got a down on the drink." "Have they caught him?" asked Bunting perfunctorily. "Lord, no, they'll never catch him. It must have happened hours and hours ago. They was both stone cold, one each end of a little passage what ain't used no more. That's why they didn't find him before." The hoarse cries were coming nearer and nearer, 2 news vendors trying to outshout each other. "'Orrible discovery near King's Cross," they yelled exultingly. "The Avenger again." And Bunting, with his daughter's large straw hold-all in his hand, ran forward into the roadway and recklessly gave a boy a penny for a halfpenny paper. He felt very much moved and excited. Somehow his acquaintance with young Joe Chandler made these murders seem a personal affair. He hoped that Chandler would come in soon and tell them all about it, as he had done yesterday morning when he, Bunting, had unluckily been out. As he walked back into the little hall, he heard Daisy's voice, high, voluble, excited, giving her stepmother a long account of the scarlet fever case, and how at first old Aunt's neighbors had thought it was not scarlet fever at all, but just nettle rash. But as Bunting pushed open the door of the sitting room, there came a cry of sharp alarm in his daughter's voice, and he heard her cry, "Why, Ellen, whatever is the matter? You do look bad." And his wife's muffled answer, "Open the window, do." "'Orrible discovery near King's Cross, a clue at last," yelled the newspaper boys triumphantly. And then helplessly Mrs. Bunting began to laugh. She laughed and laughed and laughed, rocking herself to and fro as if in an ecstasy of mirth. "Why, father, whatever's the matter with her?" Daisy looked quite scared. "She's in 'sterics, that's what it is," he said shortly. "I'll just get the water jug. Wait a minute." Bunting felt very put out. Ellen was ridiculous, that's what she was, to be so easily upset. The lodger's bell suddenly pealed through the quiet house. Either that sound or maybe the threat of the water jug had a magical effect on Mrs. Bunting. She rose to her feet, still shaking all over but mentally composed. "I'll go up," she said a little chokingly. "As for you, child, just run down into the kitchen. You'll find a piece of pork roasting in the oven. You might start paring the apples for the sauce." As Mrs. Bunting went upstairs, her legs felt as if they were made of cotton wool. She put out a trembling hand and clutched at the banister for support. But soon, making a great effort over herself, she began to feel more steady, and after waiting for a few moments on the landing, she knocked at the door of the drawing-room. Mr. Sleuth's voice answered her from the bedroom. "I'm not well," he called out querulously. "I think I've caught a chill. I should be obliged if you would kindly bring me up a cup of tea and put it outside my door, Mrs. Bunting." "Very well, sir." Mrs. Bunting turned and went downstairs. She still felt queer and giddy, so instead of going into the kitchen, she made the lodger his cup of tea over her sitting-room gas ring. During their midday dinner, the husband and wife had a little discussion as to where Daisy should sleep. It had been settled that a bed should be made up for her in the top back room, but Mrs. Bunting saw reason to change this plan. "I think 'twould be better if Daisy were to sleep with me, Bunting, and you was to sleep upstairs." Bunting felt and looked rather surprised, but he acquiesced. Ellen was probably right. The girl would be rather lonely up there, and after all, they didn't know much about the lodger, though he seemed a respectable gentleman enough. Daisy was a good-natured girl. She liked London and wanted to make herself useful to her stepmother. "I'll wash up. Don't you bother to come downstairs," she said cheerfully. Bunting began to walk up and down the room. His wife gave him a furtive glance. She wondered what he was thinking about. "Didn't you get a paper?" she said at last. "Yes, of course I did," he answered hastily, "but I've put it away. I thought you'd rather not look at it as you're that nervous." Again she glanced at him quickly, furtively, but he seemed just as usual. He evidently meant just what he said and no more. "I thought they was shouting something in the street. Just before I was took bad." It was now Bunting's turn to stare at his wife quickly and rather furtively. He had felt sure that her sudden attack of queerness, of hysterics, call it what you might, had been due to the shouting outside. She was not the only woman in London who had got the Avenger murders on her nerves. His morning paper said quite a lot of women were afraid to go out alone. Was it possible that the curious way she had been taken just now had had nothing to do with the shouts and excitement outside? "Don't you know what it was they were calling out?" he asked slowly. Mrs. Bunting looked across at him. She would have given a very great deal to be able to lie, to pretend that she did not know what those dreadful cries had portended, but when it came to the point she found she could not do so. "Yes," she said dully, "I heard a word here and there. There's been another murder, hasn't there?" "2 other murders," he said soberly. "2? That's worse news." She turned so pale, a sallow greenish white, that Bunting thought she was again going queer. "Ellen," he said warningly. "Ellen, now do have a care. I can't think what's come over you about these murders. Turn your mind away from them, do. We needn't talk about them, not so much, that is." "But I wants to talk about them," cried Mrs. Bunting hysterically. The husband and wife were standing, one each side of the table, the man with his back to the fire, the woman with her back to the door. Bunting, staring across at his wife, felt sadly perplexed and disturbed. She really did seem ill. Even her slight, spare figure looked shrunk. For the first time, so he told himself ruefully, Ellen was beginning to look her full age. Her slender hands, she had kept the pretty soft white hands of the woman who had never done rough work, grasped the edge of the table with a convulsive movement. Bunting didn't at all like the look of her. "Oh dear," he said to himself, "I do hope Ellen isn't going to be ill. That would be a to-do just now." "Tell me about it," she commanded in a low voice. "Can't you see I'm waiting to hear? Be quick now, Bunting." "There isn't very much to tell," he said reluctantly. "There's precious little in this paper anyway, but the cabman what brought Daisy told me—" "Well?" "What I said just now. There's 2 of them this time, and they'd both been drinking heavily, poor creatures." "Was it where the others was done?" she asked, looking at her husband fearfully. "No," he said awkwardly. "No, it wasn't, Ellen. It was a good bit farther west. In fact, not so very far from here. Near King's Cross. That's how the cabman knew about it, you see. They seems to have been done in a passage which isn't used no more." And then, as he thought his wife's eyes were beginning to look rather funny, he added hastily, "There, that's enough for the present. We shall soon be hearing a lot more about it from Joe Chandler. He's pretty sure to come in sometime today." Then the 5,000 constables weren't no use, said Mrs. Bunting slowly. She had relaxed her grip of the table and was standing more upright. No use at all, said Bunting briefly. He is artful and no mistake about it. But wait a minute. He turned and took up the paper which he had laid aside on a chair. Yes, they says here that they has a clue. A clue, Bunting? Mrs. Bunting spoke in a soft, weak, die-away voice, and again, stooping somewhat, she grasped the edge of the table. But her husband was not noticing her now. He was holding the paper close up to his eyes, and he read from it in a tone of considerable satisfaction. It is gratifying to be able to state that the police at last believe they are in possession of a clue which will lead to the arrest of the— And then Bunting dropped the paper and rushed round the table. His wife, with a curious sighing moan, had slipped down onto the floor, taking with her the tablecloth as she went. She lay there in what appeared to be a dead faint, and Bunting, scared out of his wits, opened the door and screamed out, "Daisy, Daisy, come up, child. Ellen's took bad again." And Daisy, hurrying in, showed an amount of sense and resource which even at this anxious moment roused her fond father's admiration. "Get a wet sponge, Dad, quick," she cried. "A sponge, and if you've got such a thing, a drop of brandy. I'll see after her." And then, after he had got the little medicine flask, "I can't think what's wrong with Ellen," said Daisy wonderingly. "She seemed quite all right when I first came in. She was listening, interested like, to what I was telling her, and then suddenly— Well, you saw how she was took, Father. 'Tain't like Ellen this, is it now?" "No," he whispered. "No, 'tain't. But you see, child, we've been going through a pretty bad time. Worse nor I should ever have let you know of, my dear. Ellen's just feeling it now, that's what it is. She didn't say nothing, for Ellen's a good plucked one, but it's told on her. It's told on her." And then Mrs. Bunting, sitting up, slowly opened her eyes and instinctively put her hand up to her head to see if her hair was all right. She hadn't really been quite off. It would have been better for her if she had. She had simply had an awful feeling that she couldn't stand up, more, that she must fall down. Bunting's words touched a most unwonted chord in the poor woman's heart, and the eyes which she opened were full of tears. She had not thought her husband knew how she had suffered during those weeks of starving and waiting. But she had a morbid dislike of any betrayal of sentiment. To her such betrayal betokened foolishness, and so all she said was, "There's no need to make a fuss. I only turned over a little queer. I never was right off, Daisy." Pettishly she pushed away the glass in which Bunting had hurriedly poured a little brandy. "I wouldn't touch such stuff. No, not if I was dying," she exclaimed. Putting out a languid hand, she pulled herself up with the help of the table onto her feet. "Go down again to the kitchen, child." But there was a sob, a kind of tremor in her voice. "You haven't been eating properly, Ellen. That's what's the matter with you," said Bunting suddenly. "Now I come to think of it, you haven't eaten half enough these last 2 days. I always did say, in old days many a time I telled you, that a woman couldn't live on air. But there, you never believed me." Daisy stood looking from one to the other, a shadow over her bright, pretty face. "I'd no idea you'd had such a bad time, Father," she said feelingly. "Why didn't you let me know about it? I might have got something out of old Aunt." "We didn't want anything of that sort," said her stepmother hastily. "But of course, well, I expect I'm still feeling the worry now. I don't seem able to forget it. Those days of waiting, of— She restrained herself. Another moment and the word starving would have left her lips. "But everything's all right now," said Bunting eagerly. "All right, thanks to Mr. Sleuth, that is." "Yes," repeated his wife in a low, strange tone of voice. "Yes, we're all right now, and as you say, Bunting, it's all along of Mr. Sleuth." She walked across to a chair and sat down on it. "I'm just a little tottery still," she muttered. And Daisy, looking at her, turned to her father and said in a whisper, but not so low but that Mrs. Bunting heard her, "Don't you think Ellen ought to see a doctor, Father? He might give her something that would pull her round." "I won't see no doctor," said Mrs. Bunting with sudden emphasis. "I saw enough of doctors in my last place. 38 doctors in 10 months did my poor missus have. Just determined on having 'em, she was. Did they save her? No. She died just the same, maybe a bit sooner." "She was a freak, was your last mistress, Ellen," began Bunting aggressively. Ellen had insisted on staying on in that place till her poor mistress died. They might have been married some months before they were married, but for that fact, Bunting had always resented it. His wife smiled wanly. "We won't have no words about that," she said, and again she spoke in a softer, kindlier tone than usual. "Daisy, if you won't go down to the kitchen again, then I must." She turned to her stepdaughter, and the girl flew out of the room. "I think the child grows prettier every minute," said Bunting fondly. "Folks are too apt to forget that beauty is but skin deep," said his wife. She was beginning to feel better. "But still, I do agree, Bunting, that Daisy's well enough, and she seems more willing, too." "I say, we mustn't forget the lodger's dinner," Bunting spoke uneasily. "It's a bit of fish today, isn't it? Hadn't I better just tell Daisy to see to it, and then I can take it up to him, as you're not feeling quite the thing, Ellen?" "I'm quite well enough to take up Mr. Sleuth's luncheon," she said quickly. It irritated her to hear her husband speak of the lodger's dinner. They had dinner in the middle of the day, but Mr. Sleuth had luncheon. However odd he might be, Mrs. Bunting never forgot her lodger was a gentleman. "After all, he likes me to wait on him, doesn't he? I can manage all right. Don't you worry," she added after a long pause. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 8. Perhaps because his luncheon was served to him a good deal later than usual, Mr. Sleuth ate his nice piece of steamed sole upstairs with far heartier an appetite than his landlady had eaten her nice slice of roast pork downstairs. "I hope you're feeling a little better, sir," Mrs. Bunting had forced herself to say when she first took in his tray, and he had answered plaintively, querulously, "No, I can't say I feel well today, Mrs. Bunting. I am tired, very tired, and as I lay in bed I seemed to hear so many sounds, so much crying and shouting. I trust the Marylebone Road is not going to become a noisy thoroughfare, Mrs. Bunting." "Oh, no, sir, I don't think that. We're generally reckoned very quiet indeed, sir." She waited a moment. Try as she would, she could not allude to what those unwonted shouts and noises had betokened. "I expect you've got a chill, sir," she said suddenly. "If I was you, I shouldn't go out this afternoon. I'd just stay quietly indoors. There's a lot of rough people about." Perhaps there was an undercurrent of warning, of painful pleading in her toneless voice which penetrated in some way to the brain of the lodger, for Mr. Sleuth looked up, and an uneasy, watchful look came into his luminous gray eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Bunting, but I think I'll take your advice. That is, I will stay quietly at home. I am never at a loss to know what to do with myself so long as I can study the book of books." "Then you're not afraid about your eyes, sir?" said Mrs. Bunting curiously. Somehow she was beginning to feel better. It comforted her to be up here, talking to Mr. Sleuth, instead of thinking about him downstairs. It seemed to banish the terror which filled her soul, ay, and her body too, at other times. When she was with him, Mr. Sleuth was so gentle, so reasonable, so grateful. Poor, kindly, solitary Mr. Sleuth. This kind of gentleman surely wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone a human being. Eccentric, so much must be admitted. But Mrs. Bunting had seen a good deal of eccentric folk, eccentric women rather than eccentric men, in her long career as useful maid. Being in ordinary times an exceptionally sensible, well-balanced woman, she had never, in old days, allowed her mind to dwell on certain things she had learnt as to the aberrations of which human nature is capable, even well-born, well-nurtured, gentle human nature. As exemplified in some of the households where she had served, it would indeed be unfortunate if she now became morbid or hysterical. So it was in a sharp, cheerful voice, almost the voice in which she had talked during the first few days of Mr. Sleuth's stay in her house, that she exclaimed, "Well, sir, I'll be up again to clear away in about half an hour, and if you'll forgive me for saying so, I hope you will stay in and have a rest today. Nasty muggy weather, that's what it is. If there's any little thing you want, me or Bunting can go out and get it." It must have been about 4 o'clock when there came a ring at the front door. The three were sitting chatting together, for Daisy had washed up. She really was saving her stepmother a good bit of trouble, and the girl was now amusing her elders by a funny account of old Aunt's persnickety ways. "Whoever can that be?" said Bunting, looking up. "It's too early for Joe Chandler, surely." "I'll go," said his wife, hurriedly jumping up from her chair. "I'll go. We don't want no strangers in here." And as she stepped down the short bit of passage, she said to herself, "A clue? What clue?" But when she opened the front door, a glad sigh of relief broke from her. "Why, Joe, we never thought 'twas you, but you're very welcome, I'm sure. Come in." And Chandler came in, a rather sheepish look on his good-looking, fair young face. "I thought maybe that Mr. Bunting would like to know," he began in a loud, cheerful voice, and Mrs. Bunting hurriedly checked him. She didn't want the lodger upstairs to hear what young Chandler might be going to say. "Don't talk so loud," she said a little sharply. "The lodger is not very well today. He's had a cold," she added hastily, "and during the last 2 or 3 days he hasn't been able to go out." She wondered at her temerity, her hypocrisy, and that moment, those few words, marked an epoch in Ellen Bunting's life. It was the first time she had told a bold and deliberate lie. She was one of those women, there are many, many such, to whom there is a whole world of difference between the suppression of the truth and the utterance of an untruth. But Chandler paid no heed to her remarks. "Has Miss Daisy arrived?" he asked in a lower voice. She nodded, and then he went through into the room where the father and daughter were sitting. "Well," said Bunting, starting up. "Well, Joe, now you can tell us all about that mysterious clue. I suppose it'd be too good news to expect you to tell us they've caught him." "No fear of such good news as that yet awhile, if they've caught him," said Joe ruefully. "Well, I don't suppose I should be here, Mr. Bunting, but the Yard are circulating a description at last, and, well, they've found his weapon." "No," cried Bunting excitedly. "You don't say so. Whatever sort of thing is it, and are they sure 'tis his?" "Well, 'tain't sure, but it seems to be likely." Mrs. Bunting had slipped into the room and shut the door behind her, but she was still standing with her back against the door, looking at the group in front of her. None of them were thinking of her. She thanked God for that. She could hear everything that was said without joining in the talk and excitement. "Listen to this," cried Joe Chandler exultantly. "'Tain't given out yet, not for the public, that is, but we was all given it by 8 o'clock this morning. Quick work, that, eh?" He read out, "Wanted. A man of age approximately 28, slight in figure, height approximately 5 feet 8 inches, complexion dark, no beard or whiskers, wearing a black diagonal coat, hard felt hat, high white collar and tie, carried a newspaper parcel, very respectable appearance." Mrs. Bunting walked forward. She gave a long, fluttering sigh of unutterable relief. "There's the chap," said Joe Chandler triumphantly. "And now, Miss Daisy," he turned to her jokingly, but there was a funny little tremor in his frank, cheerful-sounding voice, "if you knows of any nice, likely young fellow that answers to that description, well, you've only got to walk in and earn your reward of £500. £500! Cried Daisy and her father simultaneously. "Yes, that's what the Lord Mayor offered yesterday. Some private bloke, nothing official about it. But we of the Yard is barred from taking that reward, worse luck. And it's too bad, for we has all the trouble after all." "Just hand that bit of paper over, will you?" said Bunting. "I'd like to con it over to myself." Chandler threw over the bit of flimsy. A moment later Bunting looked up and handed it back. "Well, it's clear enough, isn't it?" "Yes, and there's hundreds, nay, thousands of young fellows that might be a description of," said Chandler sarcastically. "As a pal of mine said this morning, there isn't a chap will like to carry a newspaper parcel after this. And it won't do to have a respectable appearance, eh?" Daisy's voice rang out in merry, pealing laughter. She greatly appreciated Mr. Chandler's witticism. "Why on earth didn't the people who saw him try and catch him?" asked Bunting suddenly. And Mrs. Bunting broke in a lower voice. "Yes, Joe, that seems odd, don't it?" Joe Chandler coughed. "Well, it's this way," he said. "No one person did see all that. The man who's described here is just made up from the description of 2 different folk who think they saw him. You see, the murders must have taken place, well, now let me see, perhaps at 2 o'clock this last time. 2 o'clock, that's the idea. Well, at such a time as that, not many people are about, especially on a foggy night. Yes, one woman declares she saw a young chap walking away from the spot where 'twas done, and another one, but that was a good bit later, says the Avenger passed by her. It's mostly her they're following in this here description, and then the boss who has charge of that sort of thing looked up what other people had said. I mean, when the other crimes was committed. That's how he made up this wanted." Then the Avenger may be quite a different sort of man, said Bunting slowly, disappointedly. Well, of course he may be. But no, I think that description fits him all right, said Chandler, but he also spoke in a hesitating voice. You was saying, Joe, that they found a weapon? Observed Bunting insinuatingly. He was glad that Ellen allowed the discussion to go on, in fact that she even seemed to take an intelligent interest in it. She had come up close to them and now looked quite her old self again. Yes, they believe they've found the weapon what he does his awful deeds with, said Chandler. At any rate, within 100 yards of that little dark passage where they found the bodies, one at each end that was, there was discovered this morning a very peculiar kind of knife, keen as a razor, pointed as a dagger. That's the exact words the boss used when he was describing it to a lot of us. He seemed to think a lot more of that clue than of the other. I mean, than of the description people gave of the chap who walked quickly by with a newspaper parcel. But now there's a pretty job in front of us. Every shop where they sell or might have sold such a thing as that knife, including every eating house in the East End, has got to be called at. Whatever for? Asked Daisy. Why, with an idea of finding out if anyone saw such a knife fooling about there any time, and if so, in whose possession it was at the time. But Mr. Bunting, Chandler's voice changed. It became businesslike, official. They're not going to say anything about that, not in newspapers, till tomorrow, so don't you go and tell anybody. You see, we don't want to frighten the fellow off. If he knew they'd got his knife, well, he might just make himself scarce, and they don't want that. If it's discovered that any knife of that kind was sold, say, a month ago, to some customer whose ways are known, then... What'll happen then? Said Mrs. Bunting, coming nearer. Well, then, nothing will be put about it in the papers at all, said Chandler deliberately. The only object of letting the public know about it would be if nothing was found. I mean, if the search of the shops and so on was no good. Then, of course, we must try and find out someone, some private person like, who's watched that knife in the criminal's possession. It's there the reward, the £500 will come in. Oh, I'd give anything to see that knife, exclaimed Daisy, clasping her hands together. You cruel, bloodthirsty girl, cried her stepmother passionately. They all looked round at her, surprised. Come, come, Ellen, said Bunting reprovingly. Well, it is a horrible idea, said his wife sullenly, to go and sell a fellow being for £500. But Daisy was offended. Of course I'd like to see it, she cried defiantly. I never said nothing about the reward. That was Mr. Chandler said that. I only said I'd like to see the knife. Chandler looked at her soothingly. Well, the day may come when you will see it, he said slowly. A great idea had come into his mind. No, what makes you think that? If they catches him, and if you comes along with me to see our Black Museum at the Yard, you'll certainly see the knife, Miss Daisy. They keeps all them kind of things there. So if, as I say, this weapon should lead to the conviction of the Avenger, well then, that knife will be there and you'll see it. The Black Museum? Why, whatever do they have a museum in your place for? Asked Daisy wonderingly. I thought there was only the British Museum. And then even Mrs. Bunting, as well as Bunting and Chandler, laughed aloud. You're a goosey girl, said her father fondly. Why, there's a lot of museums in London. The town's thick with 'em. Ask Ellen there. She and me used to go to them kind of places when we was courting, if the weather was bad. But our museum's the one that would interest Miss Daisy, broke in Chandler eagerly. It's a regular chamber of ours. Why, Joe, you never told us about that place before, said Bunting excitedly. Do you really mean that there's a museum where they keep all sorts of things connected with crimes? Things like knives murders have been committed with? Knives, cried Joe, pleased at having become the center of attention, for Daisy had also fixed her blue eyes on him, and even Mrs. Bunting looked at him expectantly. Much more than knives, Mr. Bunting. Why, they've got there in little bottles the real poison what people have been done away with. And can you go there whenever you like? Asked Daisy wonderingly. She had not realized before what extraordinary and agreeable privileges are attached to the position of a detective member of the London police force. Well, I suppose I could, Joe smiled. Anyway, I can certainly get leave to take a friend there. He looked meaningly at Daisy, and Daisy looked eagerly at him. But would Ellen ever let her go out by herself with Mr. Chandler? Ellen was so prim, so irritatingly proper. But what was this father was saying? Do you really mean that, Joe? Yes, of course I do. Well, then, look here. If it isn't asking too much of a favor, I should like to go along there with you very much one day. I don't want to wait till the Avengers caught. Bunting smiled broadly. I'd be quite content as it is with what there is in that museum of yours. Ellen there, he looked across at his wife, don't agree with me about such things, yet I don't think I'm a bloodthirsty man. But I'm just terribly interested in all that sort of thing, always have been. I used to positively envy the butler in that Balham mystery. Again a look passed between Daisy and the young man. It was a look which contained and carried a great many things backwards and forwards, such as, "Now isn't it funny that your father should want to go to such a place? But still, I can't help it if he does want to go, so we must put up with his company, though it would have been much nicer for us to go just by our two selves." And then Daisy's look answered quite as plainly, though perhaps Joe didn't read her glance quite as clearly as she had read his. "Yes, it is tiresome, but father means well, and 'twill be very pleasant going there even if he does come too. Well, what do you say to the day after tomorrow, Mr. Bunting? I'd call for you here about, shall we say 2:30, and just take you and Miss Daisy down to the yard. 'Twouldn't take very long. We could go all the way by bus, right down to Westminster Bridge." He looked round at his hostess. "Wouldn't you join us, Mrs. Bunting? 'Tis truly a wonderful, interesting place." But his hostess shook her head decidedly. "'Twould turn me sick," she exclaimed, "to see the bottle of poison what had done away with the life of some poor creature. And as for knives—" A look of real horror, of startled fear crept over her pale face. "There, there," said Bunting hastily. "Live and let live. That's what I always say. Ellen ain't on in this turn. She can just stay at home and mind the cat. I beg his pardon, I mean the lodger." "I won't have Mr. Sleuth laughed at," said Mrs. Bunting darkly. "But there, I'm sure it's very kind of you, Joe, to think of giving Bunting and Daisy such a rare treat." She spoke sarcastically, but none of the three who heard her understood that. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Leanne Howlett.